They called my husband a legend in oil. I just called him Rick. After he died, my 2 sons came home with gentle voices and legal folders. "Mom, just sign this," they said. I thought they were protecting me. I didn't know they were signing me away. In 1 week, I went from owning an empire to being locked inside a clinic, declared unfit by the same sons I raised. This isn't about money. It's about how love turns into control, and how I took my life back. When my husband Richard Alderson died, the house felt too large for sound. Reporters called him a legend in oil. I just called him Rick. At the will reading, the lawyer's voice was calm and steady. He said, "Everything, including the controlling shares of Alder Energy Holdings, passes solely to Mrs. Alderson." There was silence. Then the sound of pens clicking. On my left sat Andrew, 35, an architect from Chicago. Tailored, polished, always impatient. On my right, Daniel, 30, a heart specialist from Houston. Cool smile, careful eyes. They hugged me for the cameras outside the courthouse. The flashlights made their smiles look almost real. But when the doors closed behind us, I saw it clearly. There was no grief in their eyes. No warmth. Only calculation. They were already measuring what my signature could buy. Within weeks after the funeral, my sons began to act helpful. They spoke softly, used professional words, and moved around me like nurses in a ward. Andrew said I looked tired. Daniel asked if I was sleeping well. I told them I was fine, but they kept exchanging glances, whispering as if I had already forgotten how to hear. Daniel, being a doctor, took the lead. He said he wanted to make sure I was healthy, that grief could confuse memory. A few days later, he showed me a report. It had my name, a hospital logo, and the words "mild cognitive decline" written in neat black print. I asked when I had been tested. He smiled and said, "Mom, it's just preventive. You don't need to worry." Andrew came next. He said the house was too big for me alone. He had found a wellness center near the coast, a private retreat, quiet and safe. He said it was temporary, that I could rest there while he managed the company paperwork. I refused at first. He didn't argue, just sighed and said, "Mom, please, trust us. Dad would want you to rest." One morning, Daniel brought a folder and said I needed to sign a few insurance documents. He laid the papers on the kitchen table, already marked with sticky notes. My glasses slipped when I tried to read. He said, "It's just hospital authorizations, nothing financial." I believed him. I signed. That signature changed everything. 2 days later, a driver arrived. Daniel told me it was for a checkup at the center. He even packed my suitcase himself. When we reached the building, it looked modern, expensive, with high windows and cameras above every door. Inside, a woman in uniform greeted me. She asked for my ID and took my purse. I turned to Daniel, confused. He smiled gently, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "Just rest, Mom. It's temporary." Then he walked away before the elevator doors closed. The room was bright, too clean, and the door had no handle on the inside. I pressed the call button. No one came for 10 minutes. When a nurse finally appeared, I asked when I could go home. She looked at her clipboard and said, "Mrs. Alderson, your son's authorized observation. Minimum stay, 30 days. I felt my chest tighten. Observation for what? She didn't answer. The next day, I demanded to call my attorney. They told me my phone privileges were restricted for safety reasons. I asked to see my sons. They said family visits required approval. Approval from whom? From Daniel Alderson, listed as my medical proxy. I didn't remember signing that, but I had. His name was on every document. Days blurred. Staff treated me politely, but with that same tone people use for a child. My meals arrived on schedule, my room checked at night. When I asked for news about the company, the nurse said, "Your sons are handling everything beautifully." I began noticing small things. My jewelry was missing from my suitcase. The mail stopped coming. Even my wedding ring was gone. They said it had been stored for safety. Once, I overheard 2 nurses talking in the hallway. One said, "She doesn't seem confused to me." The other whispered, "Not our business, the family pays premium." That night, I sat by the window and counted cars leaving the parking lot. I thought about Richard. He had built an empire from nothing, fought every boardroom battle himself. I could almost hear his voice, calm, practical. "Never sign what you haven't read, Miriam." Always keep a copy. I had failed both rules. On the 6th day, I saw a document folder on the staff desk when a nurse left it open. My name was printed in bold, under the heading, Residential Care Authorization, Indefinite. The signature below was mine. That night, I didn't sleep. I memorized every camera location, every schedule of the night shift. I realized no one checked the garden door after midnight. The next evening, I tried to leave. The door was alarmed. Within seconds, 2 guards appeared. They were polite but firm. One said, "Mrs. Alderson, please don't make this harder." I said, "I'm not a prisoner." He answered quietly, "Ma'am, technically, you're under medical supervision." I stopped fighting. For now. On the 7th day, I asked for a pen and paper. The nurse hesitated but brought them. I started writing everything: times, names, dates, details of every conversation. I kept the pages hidden inside a Bible from the nightstand. I knew one thing with absolute certainty: this wasn't care. It was control disguised as love. They wanted my signature, my silence, and my shares. But they had forgotten something. I wasn't just their mother. I was Richard Alderson's partner for 40 years. I had seen corporate betrayal before, only this time, it wore my sons' faces. I waited. I smiled at the nurses. I took the pills they gave me but hid them under my tongue. I thanked Daniel on the phone when he called to check in. And every time I heard the locks click at night, I reminded myself of one truth. They think I'm losing my mind. But I'm only getting started. At first, they worked together like businessmen closing a deal. They met with lawyers, accountants, and advisors, speaking on my behalf while I was locked away. Daniel handled the medical justification, Andrew managed the corporate paperwork. They called it temporary power of attorney for my protection. They sounded calm, professional, like good sons doing what was necessary. But greed never stays loyal. It demands more space than 2 men can share. Andrew started first. He told the board that consolidation was urgent. He said the company needed modernization, that my old-fashioned values were holding it back. Behind that speech, he was quietly moving assets. He forged transfer papers that redirected my controlling shares into his own architectural development fund. The documents looked legitimate. The signatures were copies of mine, perfectly traced from earlier contracts. He planned to sell off part of Alder Energy's land reserves, the same oil fields Richard once called his life's blood. In his mind, it was transformation, not theft. He would build luxury communities, towers with his name on them, the Alderson legacy, a monument to his vision. Daniel found out 2 weeks later. He didn't confront his brother. He simply smiled, pretended to agree with every plan, and began preparing his own. Using his hospital contacts, he created a medical profile for Andrew, filled with subtle red flags. It suggested manic behavior, insomnia, possible substance dependency. He even added notations about workplace aggression. The file was sent to a private investigator posing as a due diligence consultant. Within days, rumors started circulating in business circles. Investors began to hesitate. Andrew grew paranoid. He thought the board was turning against him. He blamed me at first, thinking I was manipulating things from the clinic. But he didn't know the full story. Daniel was feeding the rumors directly to the firm's compliance office while smiling across family dinners and pretending concern. Meanwhile, Daniel had another plan. He reached out to an old friend at a private bank in Zurich. Using his mother's name, he created a guardianship trust, claiming I was medically incompetent. He attached the false report he had written about my cognitive decline. The trust gave him full control of all liquid assets until I was declared fit again. The signature was mine. The notary's stamp was fake. Andrew discovered the transfer just in time. He called Daniel late at night. The call was recorded later by investigators, but at the time, it sounded almost civil. Andrew asked how Daniel could steal from their own mother. Daniel replied that he was protecting the company from Andrew's instability. The argument ended with silence. 2 days later, Daniel's hospital credentials were flagged for review. Someone had submitted an anonymous complaint about falsified prescriptions. He blamed Andrew, of course. By then, neither of them cared about me. I was a symbol, a signature, a name on a ledger. They were fighting for control of what Richard built and what I had preserved for decades. They forgot that I had not lost my mind. Inside the clinic, I had access to one advantage they underestimated. The facility's network was connected to Alder Energy's medical insurance division. One of the nurses, an old employee from one of our company's early charity programs, recognized me. Her name was Leah. Quiet, loyal, discreet. She told me the truth, that every communication from my sons went through one administrator. She also helped me access a visitor terminal. From there, I reached the attorney Richard had trusted for 40 years, Mr. Garrison. He confirmed what I already suspected: both my sons were transferring assets and using my name to do it. We acted quickly. Before they could drain everything, Garrison established a mirror trust that copied every digital transaction in real time to an encrypted offshore server. It recorded dates, IP addresses, document metadata. Everything. Neither of them knew it existed. Every email they sent, every forged file they uploaded, was preserved. From my room, I watched the chaos unfold in silence. Andrew accused Daniel of medical fraud. Daniel countered by accusing Andrew of embezzlement. Each of them hired separate lawyers. They tried to pull me into their arguments, sending me letters filled with half-truths. Andrew wrote that Daniel was manipulating me. Daniel wrote that Andrew was unstable and dangerous. Both addressed me as if I were helpless. I responded to neither. I simply documented. The clinic staff began to notice my calm. They started treating me differently, maybe sensing I wasn't as fragile as my files suggested. I kept my head down and waited. Then one morning, a nurse brought me breakfast and whispered that a subpoena had been issued against my company. Both my sons were named. She said the FBI had been notified due to suspicious cross-state wire transfers. That was the first moment I allowed myself to breathe. The trap had begun to close. Andrew tried to flee to London for a design conference, but his passport was frozen due to an ongoing investigation. Daniel tried to claim he was framed, presenting his fake medical files as proof. It backfired. The investigator noticed inconsistencies in the handwriting and formatting. Both of them started drowning in the evidence they had created to destroy each other. I didn't feel triumph, only a heavy kind of peace. They were still my sons. I remembered their birthdays, their favorite meals, the way they once competed to make their father proud. But I also remembered Richard's warning. Power without conscience turns sons into strangers. I had loved them both more than they would ever understand. But love does not excuse betrayal. And I knew this was only the beginning of what I needed to do. They had tried to bury me under false signatures and locked doors. Now I would bury their lies under proof. I wasn't going to punish them with revenge. I would punish them with truth. 3 months later, I walked out of that facility. Not as a patient, not as a victim, but as a plaintiff. My lawyer, Mr. Garrison, met me at the courthouse steps. He handed me a folder filled with documents, recordings, and notarized statements. I signed each one carefully, reading every line this time. Each signature was my own, freely made. This was no longer about family. It was about justice. The case moved quickly once the evidence surfaced. The encrypted data from the Mirror Trust showed every forged file, every unauthorized transfer, every email between my sons and their advisors. The video recordings from the clinic showed their conversations with staff, instructing them to falsify notes about my condition. One clip showed Daniel saying the words, "Write down paranoia, hallucinations, early onset." Another showed Andrew sliding a stack of documents to a nurse and offering her a bonus for her cooperation. Those tapes were impossible to explain away. In court, both sons appeared confident at first. Andrew wore his tailored gray suit, the same one he used for investor presentations. Daniel looked calm, hiding behind medical precision. They expected the case to dissolve, to be settled quietly before trial. But when the judge allowed the footage to be shown publicly, their confidence disappeared. The first video began with audio only. Andrew's voice was clear, controlled, as he discussed transferring company shares without my knowledge. When the camera switched on, the jurors saw his handwriting matching mine, letter for letter. Then came Daniel's footage, showing him coaching clinic staff to record false symptoms. Each brother watched the other's betrayal unfold in real time. The courtroom stayed silent except for the sound of the videos playing. When the lights came back on, both legal teams started arguing at once. Daniel's attorney blamed Andrew for manipulating their mother's trust. Andrew's defense claimed Daniel orchestrated the whole plan for control. The prosecutor didn't have to speak much. The evidence spoke for itself. I sat there, not as their mother but as a witness. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I listened to two men who once shared a bedroom as children now accuse each other of crimes that could put them in prison. I remembered their laughter when they were small, how they used to fight over who would sit next to me at dinner. Now they could barely look at me. During cross-examination, Daniel tried to justify himself. He said he was protecting me, that he feared Andrew would ruin the company. His words were smooth, professional, almost rehearsed. Then the prosecutor played the recording of him saying, "Once she's declared unfit, I'll take care of everything." The jury watched him lower his head. Andrew's turn was worse. He claimed he forged my signature to secure the assets before Daniel could misuse them. When asked if he realized it was illegal, he said he was acting out of necessity. Then came an email from him to a real estate developer promising access to land owned by Alder Energy. That promise was dated 2 days after my confinement began. The press was relentless. Headlines ran the next morning: oil heirs accused of conspiring against their own mother. News vans lined the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions as I left each day. I never answered them. My silence was deliberate. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. After weeks of hearings, the judge offered both sons a chance to settle. I rejected it. I wanted the record to exist publicly. Not for revenge, but so no one could ever twist the story again. When the final verdict was read, both were found guilty of fraud, falsification of documents, and attempted unlawful guardianship. The judge suspended part of the sentence under conditions: restitution of all stolen funds and permanent removal from any executive positions within the company. When it was my turn to speak before sentencing, I asked to approach the bench. The courtroom went silent. I said, "Your Honor, I am not asking for prison. I am asking for truth to remain permanent. My sons will live with what they've done. That is punishment enough." The judge nodded. The room stayed quiet for several seconds before he approved my request. After the hearing, I walked out through the same doors where I had once stood after Richard's will reading. The cameras flashed again, but this time, I wasn't pretending. Reporters asked if I felt vindicated. I said one thing only: love without honesty destroys everything it touches. Then I got into the car and left. Back home, the house was almost empty. Most of the staff had resigned during the chaos. The halls felt cold but peaceful. I poured myself tea and opened the folder with the final court documents. At the bottom was a note from my attorney reminding me that restitution would be transferred within 30 days. The total value was enormous, but the number meant nothing to me anymore. That night, I sat in Richard's old study and drafted a new plan. I would sell part of my shares, liquidate unnecessary holdings, and create something that couldn't be corrupted: a foundation under my name, dedicated to helping people who couldn't fight back. It wasn't a decision made out of anger. It was balance. Money had torn my family apart. It would now be used to repair what greed destroys. Within 2 weeks, the legal paperwork for the foundation was complete. I named it the Miriam Alderson Foundation. It would fund shelters for women leaving abusive homes, provide legal support for seniors trapped by manipulative relatives, and sponsor free veterinary care for people who couldn't afford it. Every detail was checked twice, every policy designed to make sure no one could ever twist it for profit. When I signed those final documents, I realized something important. My sons had taken everything they could touch, but they never understood what power really is. Power is not control, it's conscience. And that was something they could never steal. As the foundation launched, I received letters from strangers, people who had seen the case, people thanking me for standing up. Each one reminded me why I survived all of it. I had lost 2 sons to greed. But I had gained clarity, and maybe even purpose. And that was more than enough to keep living. I didn't leave that clinic because they let me go. I left because I had a plan. While they thought I was sedated, I was collecting evidence. The cameras I had once donated to improve the hospital's security recorded everything. They underestimated the woman who had built their world. When my lawyer, Mr. Garrison, received the signal from my encrypted backup server, the process started moving fast. He filed for an emergency court order. Within 24 hours, federal agents and private security entered the facility. The staff said nothing. The administrator kept her hands on the desk, shaking. They all knew they had been caught by their own greed. When I walked out through the front door, the guard avoided my eyes. There were no sons waiting, no cameras, no reporters. Only my lawyer and a notary. The first document I signed after leaving that place was a lawsuit against two people, Andrew and Daniel Alderson, my sons. We gathered everything: emails, phone recordings, forged signatures, bank transfers. Every file was mirrored to a secure server in Zurich. My company had a cybersecurity division Richard had built years ago. He always said, the biggest thieves are the ones with the keys. Now his system did exactly what he designed it to do. When the prosecutors received the data, both of my sons learned about it from official summonses. Their attorneys tried to reach out for a family settlement. They asked to talk, to make things right. I refused. Family ended the day they signed my confinement papers. Because of the international transfers, the case went federal. The charges included fraud, forgery, and attempted unlawful guardianship. It was serious, but I knew they didn't believe I would go through with it. They thought I'd give up halfway, like a mother who couldn't bear to destroy her own children. The first hearing took place 2 weeks later. I sat beside Garrison in the courtroom. My sons avoided my eyes. They looked only at each other, suspicious, angry, already divided. Their colleagues were in the room, the press too, waiting for a scandal. The prosecutor began with video footage from the clinic. It showed Daniel instructing the staff to write hallucinations and paranoia in my file. Then Andrew appeared on screen, sliding papers across a table to the administrator, offering her a bonus for cooperation. Their voices were clear, their faces calm. The courtroom went silent. When the financial evidence followed, offshore wire transfers, matching signatures, corporate emails, the defense collapsed. Andrew's lawyer tried to claim the documents were fabricated. But the metadata traced back to Alder Energy's own internal servers. Those logs don't lie. I watched everything quietly. No rage, no tears. My goal wasn't revenge. It was exposure. They wanted to win, but they had already lost the moment they saw me as an obstacle instead of their mother. After the videos ended, the judge asked if I wanted to speak. I stood and said, my sons are gifted men. One designs buildings, the other saves hearts. But they forgot something simple: without conscience, every career becomes worthless. I don't want their blood. I want the truth on record. Paper doesn't lie. Then I sat down. The jury didn't look at me. They looked at the two men who didn't know where to put their hands. 3 weeks later, both were found guilty. But the sentencing was postponed so I could decide whether to request prison time. I already knew my answer. Prison wouldn't bring me peace. I made a different decision, the one they least expected. I would not destroy them. I would remove them. At the next hearing, I submitted a short written statement through my attorney. It read, I ask the court to release both defendants from custody but grant them no access to inheritance, assets, or any financial benefit connected to my name. The judge agreed. It was not punishment, it was consequence. When the process ended, I walked out of the courthouse without looking back. I knew the future wouldn't be empty, it would be clean. I had something new to build. Something none of them could steal. That was the day the next chapter began. The one people would later call the inheritance that couldn't be stolen. When the verdict was finalized, the court clerk handed me a copy of the judgment. Both of my sons were officially removed from any legal or financial claim to Alder Energy Holdings. Their names were erased from the board, their access revoked from every account. For the first time in months, my life was mine again. I had the right to pursue criminal charges further. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, all serious offenses. The prosecutor was ready to continue, but I declined. Prison would not teach them what they needed to learn. It would only make them bitter, more convinced they were victims of circumstance. I wanted accountability, not destruction. So I asked the judge to dismiss the custodial sentence under one condition: complete financial separation. They would never again have access to a single dollar tied to my name or my husband's company. The court accepted. After the ruling, both sons tried to contact me. Andrew sent a long email, full of regret and excuses. He said he had only tried to modernize the company, that his brother pushed him into desperation. Daniel sent a formal letter on hospital stationery. He apologized for the stress he caused but insisted he only acted out of concern for my safety. I didn't answer either message. Forgiveness doesn't always require conversation. Sometimes, silence is the only boundary that keeps peace alive. The following week, I called my financial advisor and gave him clear instructions. Sell a portion of my remaining shares. Transfer the proceeds to a new charitable foundation. I wanted every dollar that once fueled their greed to serve a purpose they could never understand. We spent weeks drafting the charter, setting up the board, defining the mission. No family members were allowed to serve as trustees. The organization had to stand independently, protected from personal interests. I named it the Miriam Alderson Foundation. It would focus on 4 areas. First, shelters for women escaping domestic abuse. Second, grants for education programs aimed at seniors returning to school or starting small businesses. Third, free veterinary clinics for people who considered their pets family but lacked the means to care for them. And fourth, legal aid for the elderly facing exploitation by relatives or caretakers. Every area represented a group I had once overlooked while living in luxury. At the press conference announcing the foundation, reporters asked whether I was trying to repair my image after the family scandal. I told them no, I was repairing my conscience. I said, I had 2 sons who wanted my money. Now I have thousands of children who need my help. The statement went viral, though I didn't care about the headlines. I only cared that applications started arriving within 48 hours. The first case the foundation funded was an elderly woman from Kansas City whose nephew had emptied her retirement account. She had nowhere to go. Our lawyers recovered every cent. The second grant went to a 70-year-old man in Ohio who had written software in his youth and wanted to learn coding again to teach others. The third was a small veterinary mobile unit that traveled through rural areas offering free treatment for animals of low-income families. Those small successes meant more to me than any stock certificate ever had. Meanwhile, Andrew's architecture firm collapsed within 6 months. Investors withdrew, and his name became associated with fraud. He moved out of Chicago, filed for bankruptcy, and started freelancing under a different name. Daniel lost his medical license temporarily while under review for falsifying patient data. He eventually found work in a private clinic abroad. They rarely spoke to each other, except when trying to assign blame for their downfall. I didn't follow their stories closely. Occasionally, an assistant would bring me updates from public records, but I never asked for them. My focus stayed on the foundation. We expanded quickly, opening branches in 5 states. I hired people who had survived similar experiences, women and men who had been stripped of dignity by the people closest to them. Their professionalism impressed me. Their gratitude humbled me. Still, there were quiet nights when I thought about my sons. I wasn't immune to sadness. A mother doesn't stop caring just because her children have fallen. But I also understood something I never had before. Love without respect destroys both sides. I had spent years believing that forgiving meant allowing someone back into your life. Now I knew forgiveness could also mean closing the door and wishing them well from afar. Once, near the end of the first fiscal year, I received a handwritten note in the mail. No return address. The writing was familiar, Daniel's. It said only this: I understand now. I hope one day you'll believe that. I folded the letter, put it in a drawer, and never spoke of it. That was enough. As months turned into a year, the foundation became financially self-sustaining. Donors joined, volunteers grew, and every month we received hundreds of thank you letters. I made it a rule to read a few each morning with my tea. One came from a retired teacher in Texas who had been scammed by her own son. She wrote that hearing my story gave her the strength to press charges. Another was from a young woman in Detroit who escaped an abusive marriage thanks to one of our shelters. She said she planned to study law to help others. Those letters were my new family photos. They reminded me what real legacy means. Wealth had once divided my bloodline. Now it united strangers in survival. That irony didn't escape me. Richard would have appreciated the efficiency of it, turning misused capital into structured good. I thought of him often. He built the fortune. I learned how to cleanse it. One evening, a journalist asked if I regretted not sending my sons to prison. I said no. I would rather let them live with their choices. Freedom is heavier than bars when you carry guilt. I ended the interview with a single sentence that later became the Foundation's motto. Love is not a currency. You can spend it all, and it still returns, but only if it's real. Andrew and Daniel were left with nothing tangible, no houses, no accounts, no inheritance. What they had instead was the knowledge of what they lost and why. It was the only lesson that might still save them someday. For me, it was closure. When I looked at the organization's first annual report, showing thousands of people helped and millions allocated to good causes, I realized that I had done what mattered most. I turned betrayal into structure, loss into movement, and guilt into purpose. They had tried to take everything. But they couldn't take me. I live by the ocean now, in a small white cottage that used to belong to a fisherman. No guards, no board meetings, no locked doors. Just quiet. Each morning, the mail arrives in a canvas bag, letters from people I will never meet. A woman who escaped an abusive husband. A retired teacher who used our grant to open a reading club for seniors. A nurse who adopted a stray dog saved by one of our clinics. I keep their words in boxes labeled by year. Sometimes I read them out loud to remind myself why I'm still here. Money built walls around me once, now it builds bridges for others. When visitors ask if I ever regret forgiving my sons, I tell them this: real wealth isn't what you leave in a will. It's what you leave in people's lives. Then I close the letters, pour tea, and watch the tide come in, calm, steady, and mine. Moral: when money becomes an idol, even love turns into competition and family becomes a battlefield. I've seen it, how greed blinds, how ambition erases blood. But there's one thing no one can ever steal: conscience. It's the last treasure that never loses value. If you recognize even a piece of your story, remember, truth doesn't ask for permission, and dignity is the only inheritance that truly lasts. Miriam Alderson. If this story touched you, subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters.